Barron Trump thought he knew what power looked like, until a midnight phone call upended everything he believed. Hidden deals, secret alliances, and a mysterious figure pulling the world's strings? That was only the beginning. Suddenly, he's thrown into a high-stakes game where the lines between friends and enemies blur. One by one, kings of finance and politics topple, leaving Barron standing at the epicenter of a new order. But in a world where leverage is currency and loyalty can shift in a heartbeat, does he control the game, or is the game controlling him? Prepare for a reckoning that will change everything you thought you knew about power. The clock struck midnight in the Trump family estate, the vast mansion sitting silent under the pale glow of the moon. Security lights flickered along the property's perimeter, casting long shadows over the perfectly manicured lawns. Inside, the house was still, save for the occasional hum of the air conditioning and the soft ticking of an antique grandfather clock in the hallway. Barron Trump sat alone in his room, scrolling through his phone, his tall frame slouched slightly against the leather chair by his desk. It was a rare night of peace. No cameras, no events, no eyes watching him. Just silence and solitude. He had spent the evening going through some reading, catching up on news, and replying to a few messages. Unlike many his age, he had a sharp mind for business, politics, and history, subjects that fascinated him more than the latest TikTok trends. But just as he was about to turn in for the night, his phone buzzed. A call. No caller ID. Barron narrowed his eyes, his finger hovering over the decline button. At this hour, an unlisted number could mean anything. A prank, a wrong number, or something more. Curiosity got the better of him. He answered. Hello? For a moment, there was only silence. Then a voice, a low, distorted whisper. You don't know me, Barron, but I know you. And I have something you need to see. Barron's heart rate picked up slightly. His grip tightened around the phone. Who is this? He asked, keeping his voice calm but firm. A friend. Let's just say I know things. Things that could change everything you believe about your family. About your father. Barron stood up, pacing slightly. He had dealt with his fair share of conspiracy theories, strange messages, and online speculation. But this was different. There was something about the way this person spoke. Controlled. Deliberate. If you have something to say it now, Barron replied. A soft chuckle echoed through the phone. Check your email, the private one. You have 5 minutes. The call cut off. Barron stared at his screen, a cold unease settling over him. He immediately opened his laptop, typing in the credentials to access his private inbox, a secure email address he used only for personal matters, far away from the public eye. A new message, no subject line, no sender, just a single attachment, a photograph. Barron clicked on it, and what he saw sent a chill down his spine. It was an old document, worn, yellowed at the edges, bearing his father's name in bold letters. A contract, but not just any contract. A signature, a date, a company name he didn't recognize. And then, the most unsettling part, an unfamiliar name listed right next to Donald J. Trump's, signed in ink as if it were an equal partnership. Barron's stomach tightened. This wasn't some internet hoax. This was real. His mind raced with possibilities. Had his father been involved in something the public never knew about? Was this some long-buried business deal? Or something even deeper? Something deliberately erased from history? He needed answers. And he needed them now. Grabbing his phone, he tried calling the unknown number back. But just as he expected, there was no response. Instead, another email popped into his inbox. Meet me. Same location as the contract address. 2 a.m. Come alone. This stays between us. Barron's pulse pounded in his ears. The location listed was an abandoned office building in Lower Manhattan. somewhere his father hadn't set foot in decades. He exhaled slowly, thinking through his options. He could ignore it, act like it never happened, or he could find out the truth for himself. With a deep breath, Barron made his decision. He grabbed his coat, his keys, and his phone, slipping out of his room quietly. The mansion's halls were eerily quiet as he moved past the security cameras, navigating the estate with practiced precision. As the son of a former president, security was always watching. But Barron knew the estate better than anyone. He knew which exits had the least surveillance, which hallways were the quietest, and how to disappear without raising suspicion. Tonight, he would put that knowledge to the test. Stepping outside, he felt the cool night air hit his face as he made his way to one of the less frequently used garages. A single black SUV sat inside, its engine off but its keys waiting in the glove compartment. He slid into the driver's seat, took a deep breath, and started the car. The estate faded into the distance as he pulled onto the empty road, heading toward a truth that could change everything. And he had no idea what he was about to uncover. Barron kept his grip firm on the wheel, his mind racing as the city lights blurred past him. The roads were mostly empty at this hour, save for the occasional taxi or late-night delivery truck. He had taken a route that avoided major security checkpoints, ones that would alert his father's team that he had left the estate. He wasn't naive. If they really wanted to track him, they could. But Barron was banking on the fact that no one expected him to leave in the middle of the night, alone, without warning. The location listed in the email was an old office building in Lower Manhattan. His father had done business all over the world, but this place? It didn't match anything Barron had ever heard of. Why here? Why now? He parked the SUV 2 blocks away and stepped out, pulling his hood up to shield his face. The building loomed ahead, dark, silent, forgotten. It had that eerie stillness of a place that had been abandoned for years, yet something about it felt alive, as if it was waiting for him. A single streetlight flickered overhead. The metal door at the entrance was rusted but not locked. Barron hesitated for only a second before pushing it open. Inside, dust hung in the air, illuminated by the dim glow of the moon filtering through broken windows. The space had once been a lobby, judging by the faded remnants of a reception desk. Old chairs sat overturned in the corner, forgotten by time. And then he heard it. A faint shuffle of footsteps. Barron tensed, instinctively balling his hands into fists. A figure stepped forward from the shadows, dressed in dark clothes, their face partially obscured by a hood. But as they moved closer, Barron could make out more details. Older than him, maybe mid-30s. Sharp eyes that studied him carefully, as if trying to measure whether he was ready for whatever was about to be said. "You actually came," the man said, his voice calm, but carrying weight. Barron didn't flinch. "You left me no choice." The man smirked slightly, then gestured toward an old wooden table in the center of the room. A folder sat on it, thick with documents. "Sit," the man said. Barron didn't move. "First, I want to know who you are." The man sighed as if he expected the question but wasn't eager to answer it. "Let's just say I used to work for someone who knew your father very well. Someone who made sure certain details of history never saw the light of day." Barron's stomach tightened. "What kind of details?" The man tapped the folder. "See for yourself." Barron hesitated for only a second before stepping forward. He pulled out a chair and sat down, flipping open the folder. The first page made his breath catch in his throat. A photograph, black and white, old but clear. His father, younger, standing beside a man Barron didn't recognize. The background was familiar, though. This building. Barron turned the page. A contract, much like the one in the email. But this one had more details. It was a deal, a partnership, but not for real estate, not for business. It was something else, something hidden. The words jumped out at him. Project Guardian. Confidential agreement. Barron's heart pounded. What is this? The man leaned back against the table. It's what your father never wanted the world to know. Barron's pulse was hammering in his ears. What do you mean? The man took a deep breath. Your father wasn't just a businessman, Barron. He was part of something bigger, something secret, something that goes back decades. Barron's mind raced. He had grown up around power, around influence. But this felt different. The man continued, his voice lowering. This project, Guardian, it was a highly classified operation. It involved some of the most powerful people in the world. And your father? He wasn't just involved. He was one of the architects. Barron swallowed hard, turning another page. More photographs, more documents, a list of names, many of which had been redacted. And then, toward the bottom of the page, his father's name, clear as day. Why are you showing me this? Barron asked. The man exhaled slowly. Because what happened back then, it's not over, and you need to decide what you're going to do about it. The room felt colder now, as if the weight of the past had seeped into the air itself. Barron clenched his jaw. Tell me everything. And so, the man did. And what Barron learned that night would change everything. Part 3. The truth. No one was meant to know. Barron leaned forward, his pulse quickening as the man turned to the next page in the folder. The yellowed paper crinkled slightly as it moved, revealing a document that looked older than anything else he'd seen. At the top, stamped in bold, were the words, Project Guardian, classified. Barron felt his throat tighten. He wasn't sure what he had expected when he walked into this room, but it wasn't this. The man watched him carefully, as if waiting to see how he would react before continuing. When Barron didn't speak, he tapped the paper lightly with his index finger. This, he said, is what your father helped build. And this, he pointed at a second name below Donald Trump's, is the man he built it with. Barron read the name. Elias Monroe. The name didn't ring a bell. Who is he? The man exhaled. A ghost. At least that's what they wanted people to believe. He wasn't supposed to exist. No birth records, no social security number, no trace of him in any official capacity. And yet he was one of the most powerful men in the world. Barron's mind was spinning. What kind of project was this? The man flipped the page. The next document was a series of blueprints, plans for something massive, intricate, and deeply classified. Your father and Monroe were part of an elite group. Men who understood that power isn't just about money or politics. It's about control. Control over information, control over security, and control over the future. Barron narrowed his eyes. You still haven't told me what this project actually was. The man let out a slow breath. Because it's hard to explain in a way that won't sound insane. Try me. The man rubbed his jaw, then nodded. Project Guardian was designed to be the ultimate failsafe. A hidden force operating behind the scenes, shaping global events before they could spiral out of control. It wasn't a government operation, and it wasn't controlled by any single country. It was something beyond that, something bigger. Barron's heart pounded. And my father was part of this? He was more than a part of it, the man said. He was one of the last remaining founders, and now... He hesitated, then closed the folder. Now, it might be up to you. Barron's breath caught in his throat. Up to me? The man nodded slowly. Your father walked away from Project Guardian years ago. But just because he left doesn't mean it disappeared. Monroe vanished, but others took his place. And now, the people who control what's left of Guardian, they're looking for someone new. Barron clenched his fists. And you think they're looking at me? The man's expression darkened. I don't think. I know. A cold chill ran down Barron's spine. Why now? He asked. The man looked at him carefully. Because Monroe's name has resurfaced, and if he's still alive, then everything your father tried to bury is about to come back. Barron could hear the faint hum of the city outside, the distant sound of a siren wailing somewhere in the night. But in this room, in this moment, the world had shrunk to just the two of them. "What do they want from me?" Barron asked, his voice steady. The man hesitated, then reached into his jacket pocket. He pulled out a small device no bigger than a flash drive and set it on the table. "They want you to make a choice," he said. "Walk away and pretend you never saw this, or open that file and learn the truth." Barron stared at the device. He already knew there was no turning back. Slowly, deliberately, he reached out and picked it up. Barron's fingers tightened around the small device as the weight of the decision settled over him. The man across from him, who still hadn't given a name, watched with an unreadable expression, as if gauging just how far Barron was willing to go. "You don't have to do this," the man said. "Once you open that file, there's no going back." Barron met his gaze. "I need to know." He reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and connected the drive. The screen flickered for a moment before a single file appeared. "Project Guardian, Final Directive." His pulse quickened. He tapped the file. A video began to play. At first, the screen was dark. Then, slowly, an image came into focus. A dimly lit conference room with a long table stretching into the shadows. 6 men sat at that table, their faces partially obscured by the flickering light of an overhead lamp. Barron's breath caught in his throat as he recognized one of them. His father. Donald Trump sat at the far end, his expression grim. The timestamp in the corner of the video read, March 14th, 1998. "This meeting is now in session," a voice announced. "Final votes will be cast." A second man leaned forward, and for the first time, Barron saw his face. Elias Monroe, the man from the files, the ghost. He was older than Barron had imagined. Sharp features, piercing gray eyes that seemed to see straight through the camera. He tapped his fingers against the table. "We all know why we're here," Monroe said. "We built something too powerful, and now we have to decide whether to destroy it." Barron's heart pounded. His father spoke next. "We agreed to safeguard the system, not let it fall into the wrong hands. If we don't shut it down now, we might never be able to." The room fell silent. Then, one by one, the men at the table cast their votes. Barron watched in stunned silence as each man raised a hand. All but one. Elias Monroe. "You're making a mistake," Monroe said, his voice cold. "Guardian was never meant to be destroyed. It was meant to evolve." His father's voice was firm. "We're not gods, Monroe. No one should have this kind of power." Monroe stood slowly. "Then you leave me no choice." The screen glitched, static crackling. Then the video cut out. Barron exhaled sharply. The man across from him leaned back. That was the last known footage of Elias Monroe before he disappeared. Barron rubbed his temples, trying to process what he had just seen. "You're telling me this system, Project Guardian, was shut down?" The man didn't answer right away. "Not exactly," he finally said. "It was dismantled, in parts. But some of its core functions remained in the shadows. And Monroe, he never stopped looking for a way to bring it back." Barron clenched his jaw. "And now you think he's back?" "We don't think," the man said. "We know." Barron's mind was racing. If Monroe had resurfaced, if Guardian was still out there, then everything his father had tried to bury was at risk. "What happens now?" he asked. The man studied him for a long moment. Then he reached into his coat and slid another document across the table. Barron picked it up. At the top it read, Project Guardian, Reactivation Protocol. Beneath it, in bold letters, was a single phrase. Subject, identified, Barron William Trump. His stomach dropped. "They don't just want you to know about Guardian," the man said quietly. "They want you to lead it." Barron's breath caught in his throat as he reread the document. His name, bold, unmistakable, a target, a directive. The weight of the words pressed into his chest. Subject identified, Barron William Trump. He looked up at the man sitting across from him, his heart hammering against his ribs. "This has to be a mistake." The man shook his head. "It's not." Barron pushed back from the table, standing so fast his chair scraped against the floor. "Number, you're telling me that a project, some secret government-level operation my father and these men shut down over 20 years ago, now suddenly has my name attached to it?" His voice rose. "And I'm just supposed to accept that?" The man remained calm, watching him. "No one is telling you to accept anything. I'm just giving you the truth." Barron paced, running a hand through his hair. The room felt smaller, the walls pressing in. This was insane. "You have a choice," the man continued, "but not for long. Monroe has been in the shadows for over 2 decades. He's patient, but he's also dangerous. If your name is on that document, it means they're ready to move." Barron clenched his jaw. "Move where? For what?" The man leaned forward. "To take back control." Barron shook his head. "Number no. My father and those men, whatever they were doing, shut it down. They had their reasons. Why now? Why me?" The man's gaze darkened. "Because you're your father's son." The words hung between them, heavy with meaning. Barron swallowed hard. He knew what people said about him, that he lived in the shadow of his father, that he was quiet, a mystery, an enigma. But this was something else entirely. The man gestured toward the document still clutched in Barron's hand. "That file wasn't supposed to exist, but it does, which means Monroe has had this planned for years. He's playing a long game and you—" The man exhaled. "You were always meant to be part of it." Barron stared at him. "Meant to be part of what?" The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out another file. "This," he said, sliding it across the table. Barron hesitated, then slowly sat back down. His fingers trembled slightly as he opened the file. Inside was another document, a list of names, his father's, Elias Monroe's, other men from the video, but near the bottom, in fresh ink, was his own, alongside another name, one he recognized instantly, Alexander Donovan. His stomach turned. Raymond Donovan's son. Barron's voice was barely above a whisper. "Donovan's in this too?" The man nodded. "He's been groomed for years. Monroe knew he couldn't take back Guardian alone. He needed someone with power, someone with influence. And now, he needs you." Barron's mind raced. For years, his father had told him that true power wasn't about money or status. It was about control. The ability to dictate the course of events before anyone else even realized what was happening. And now, someone, Monroe, had been pulling those strings. His stomach twisted. "Why would Monroe want me?" Barron asked, voice tighter now. The man leaned forward, his voice low. "Because you're the last piece of the puzzle, the one thing he couldn't control." Barron exhaled sharply, his grip tightening on the file. This wasn't just some midnight call. This wasn't just about a forgotten project. This was about a war, and whether he liked it or not. He was already in it. Barron's pulse pounded in his ears as he stared at the names on the list. His name, Donovan's, Monroe's. The pieces of a puzzle he didn't even know he was a part of were suddenly locking into place. This wasn't just about some forgotten government project. It wasn't just about his father's past. It was about him. Barron forced himself to take a slow breath. He needed clarity. He needed answers. He looked up at the man across from him, his eyes cold and steady. "What does Monroe want from me?" The man sighed, leaning back slightly. It's not just about what he wants. It's about what he's been waiting for. Barron's jaw clenched. Explain. The man nodded toward the file. Guardian was never just a security project. It was designed to protect certain individuals, people who could shape the future, world leaders, innovators, power players. But somewhere along the way, Monroe and his people decided that protection wasn't enough. They wanted influence. Control. Barron frowned. Control over what? The man's gaze sharpened. Over who holds the real power. Barron let the words settle in his mind, their weight pressing down on him. He had spent his entire life under scrutiny, watched, analyzed, judged. People saw his name before they saw him. They assumed they knew what he was, who he was destined to be. But now, it wasn't just about public perception. It was about something far more dangerous. Barron exhaled sharply. And where does Donovan fit into all of this? The man's expression darkened. Monroe has been grooming him for years, preparing him to step into a role much bigger than his father ever did. The Donovans have always wanted power. Monroe gave them the blueprint. Barron's fingers curled into a fist. And me? The man hesitated, then said, You were always the wild card. Monroe couldn't predict you. He didn't know if you'd follow in your father's footsteps or forge your own path. That's why he stayed in the shadows, waiting. Barron scoffed. Waiting for what? For me to just hand over control? The man shook his head. Number. He was waiting for you to make a choice. Barron's stomach twisted. He didn't like where this was going. The man tapped the file. That's why you got the call tonight. Monroe doesn't want to risk waiting any longer. He wants you to pick a side. Barron's mouth went dry. Monroe was trying to force his hand, to push him into something before he even understood the full scope of the game being played. And that meant one thing. He was running out of time. Barron took a slow breath, forcing himself to steady his thoughts. He wasn't going to be manipulated. He wasn't going to be used as someone else's pawn. He met the man's gaze head on. What if I refuse? The man exhaled. Then Monroe will make the choice for you. A cold chill ran down Barron's spine. This wasn't just about a decision. It was about survival. Barron's fists tightened. He wasn't afraid of a fight. But this was different. This was war. And he wasn't sure he was ready for it. Barron leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. The weight of everything that had just been revealed pressed down on him like an invisible force, suffocating and inescapable. He wasn't naive. He always knew the world was full of people who operated in the shadows, pulling the strings of power without ever stepping into the spotlight. But knowing it in theory was one thing. Being thrust into the middle of it was something else entirely. The man across from him studied him carefully, waiting, watching. Barron took a slow breath, forcing his emotions into check. He needed clarity. He needed to think. So, let me get this straight, he said finally. Monroe and his people have been playing a long game, positioning themselves to influence future leaders. They've been grooming Donovan for years, and now they're trying to pull me into their orbit because they think I'll be a key player whether I want to be or not. The man nodded. That about sums it up. Barron exhaled sharply. And if I refuse? The man's gaze darkened. Then Monroe will see you as a threat. Barron's pulse quickened. He had spent his entire life under scrutiny, but this was different. This wasn't about media headlines or political speculation. This was about something deeper, more insidious. It was about control. He clenched his jaw. What does Monroe really want? The man leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. He wants certainty. He wants to know that when the time comes, you won't be standing in his way. Barron's stomach twisted. He wasn't sure what was worse, the idea that Monroe saw him as an obstacle, or the idea that he had the power to be one in the first place. For years, he had tried to stay out of the chaos that surrounded his family name. He had watched the political games from the sidelines, observed the way people maneuvered for influence, for leverage. He had always known that eventually he would have to choose a path. But he never expected it to happen like this. Not with a midnight call, not with a name he had never heard before pulling him into a war he didn't even know was being fought. The man sighed. Barron, you have to understand. Monroe doesn't make idle threats. If he's reached out to you now, it means he's already put the pieces in motion. He's not just asking for your loyalty. He's demanding it. Barron's fists tightened. And what if I don't give it? The man was silent for a long moment, then said, Then he'll make sure you don't have a choice. A cold chill ran down Barron's spine. He didn't like the sound of that. He wasn't the kind of person to be backed into a corner. He wasn't someone who took orders just because someone else expected him to. But this wasn't just a business deal. It wasn't just politics. It was something much more dangerous. Barron took a deep breath. And you? Whose side are you on? The man's lips curved into a wry smile. I'm on the side of truth. The question is, are you? Barron stared at him, his mind whirling. Truth. It sounded simple. It sounded noble. But in a world like this, truth was just another currency, traded and manipulated by those who knew how to wield it. He needed more information. He needed to understand exactly what he was up against. But one thing was clear. Monroe wasn't giving him time to think. He was being forced to act. And the next move he made could change everything. Barron's heart pounded in his chest. He wasn't just being asked to choose a side. He was being asked to decide the future. And whether he liked it or not, the clock was already ticking. Barron's mind was a battlefield of thoughts, strategies forming and breaking apart before they could solidify. He had always been a thinker, someone who analyzed situations from every angle before making a move. But now, he felt like a chess piece in someone else's game, and that was a position he refused to stay in. The man across from him studied him with quiet patience, as if he already knew what Barron was going through internally. You're realizing how deep this goes, aren't you? Barron exhaled sharply, leaning back in his chair. Yeah, and I don't like it. The man gave a knowing nod. You shouldn't. Barron tapped his fingers against the wooden table, his mind still racing. Let's say I play along. Let's say I tell Monroe what he wants to hear. What then? The man's expression darkened. Then he'll expect you to fall in line when the time comes, to publicly endorse the right people, to push his policies, to shape your image into something useful for his agenda. Barron clenched his jaw. He had spent his life under scrutiny, surrounded by people who either worshipped or despised his family name. But this was different. This wasn't about opinions or the media circus. This was about power, the kind of power that moved in silence, making decisions that shaped the world before the public even knew what was happening. He took a slow breath, steadying himself. And if I refuse? The man's eyes met his, steady and unflinching. Then Monroe will do what he always does to threats. Barron didn't need the words spelled out. He understood. People like Monroe didn't just accept no for an answer. They removed obstacles, silenced dissent, eliminated risks. He wasn't just dealing with a man who wanted influence. He was dealing with a man who was willing to burn everything down if he didn't get it. Barron's stomach twisted, but he forced himself to stay calm. Panic wouldn't help him now. He had to think, had to strategize. The man across from him leaned forward slightly. There's another option. Barron raised an eyebrow. I'm listening. You play along. Make Monroe believe you're considering his offer. Keep him close. Make him trust you. The man's expression was unreadable. And then, when the time is right, you take him down from the inside. Barron's pulse quickened. It was a dangerous idea, insanely risky. But it was also the only way to gain control. He stared at the man, searching his face for any sign of deception. And how exactly do you suggest I do that? The man smiled faintly. By doing what you were born to do. Barron frowned. Which is? The man's voice dropped to a near whisper. Be unpredictable. Barron inhaled slowly. Unpredictability. It was something his father had mastered, never letting anyone see his next move until it was too late. Was that what Monroe was afraid of? That he wouldn't be able to control him? A slow, determined resolve settled in Barron's chest. He wasn't going to be controlled. He wasn't going to be used. And if Monroe wanted a war, then he was about to find out just how dangerous an opponent Barron Trump could be. The car moved smoothly through the dimly lit streets, the city stretching out around Barron like an endless sea of shadows and lights. He sat in the back seat, his thoughts running faster than the blurred scenery outside the window. The weight of the conversation he'd just had pressed down on him, but instead of fear, there was something else growing inside him: determination. He had spent his whole life being underestimated. People saw his last name, his family's wealth, the power that came with it, and assumed they knew who he was. They thought he was just another privileged kid with an easy life, coasting by on his father's legacy. But they didn't know him. They didn't know how closely he had studied everything around him since he was old enough to understand the game of power. They didn't know that he had been watching, learning, planning. And now, for the first time, the game had truly begun. His phone vibrated. He glanced at the screen, a message from an unknown number. We need to talk, midnight, same place. No name, no details. But he already knew who it was. The driver didn't ask questions as Barron gave a new destination. The man had been hired for his silence as much as his driving skills. The car took a sharp turn down a side street, avoiding the more crowded avenues. Barron stared out the window, watching the city shift into something darker, less polished. This wasn't the world of billion-dollar boardrooms or high society galas. This was the world where power was built in the shadows. When the car finally stopped, Barron stepped out onto the sidewalk. The air was crisp, carrying the distant hum of the city's nightlife. He adjusted his jacket and walked into the alleyway, his footsteps echoing softly against the brick walls. A figure was already waiting for him. The same man from earlier, standing with his hands in his pockets, his face unreadable. You got my message, the man said. Barron nodded. Let's hear it. The man studied him for a moment, as if trying to decide just how much he could trust him. Then he sighed and gestured toward the bench nearby. Sit. Barron hesitated only for a second before lowering himself onto the cold wooden bench. The man sat beside him, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. Monroe isn't just another political power player, the man said, his voice low. He's built an empire of influence, controlling people in ways they don't even realize. Every major decision that benefits him, he's got his fingerprints on it. Barron listened, silent. Politicians, CEOs, media figures. He's got connections everywhere. And when someone doesn't cooperate, the man let the sentence trail off, but Barron already understood. Silence, or worse. You're saying he's untouchable? The man shook his head. I'm saying taking him down won't be easy. Barron exhaled, processing. Then how do we do it? The man's lips curled into a faint smile. You already know the answer to that. Barron met his gaze. From the inside. Exactly. Barron leaned back slightly, letting his mind piece together the puzzle. He wants to use me, to put me in a position where I can help push his agenda. The man nodded. Barron's jaw tightened. Then we let him believe he's winning. The man's smile widened slightly. Now you're thinking like someone who understands the game. The air between them was heavy with unspoken things. They both knew the risks. They both knew what this meant. You'll need allies, the man said after a moment. People who can help you move without Monroe knowing. Barron smirked. I already have a few names in mind. The man raised an eyebrow. That fast? You think I haven't been paying attention? Barron said. There are people around Monroe who don't trust him completely. People who are looking for a way out, a way to protect themselves if things go south. The man nodded approvingly. Good, but be careful. The wrong move, and you won't see the attack coming until it's too late. Barron stood. I know exactly what I'm doing. The man stayed seated, watching him. Then let's get started. Barron spent the next 2 weeks laying the groundwork. He played his role perfectly, letting Monroe and his people think he was slowly coming around to their way of thinking. He attended private meetings, listened to their proposals, nodded at the right moments, and all the while, he was gathering information, names, connections, weaknesses. He paid attention to the way Monroe operated, the subtle power plays he made in every conversation. He watched how the man handled his allies, how he rewarded loyalty and punished defiance. And more than anything, he looked for cracks, because no empire, no matter how powerful, was without its weaknesses. One night, at a private event, Monroe pulled him aside. "You're a smart kid, Barron," he said, swirling the whiskey in his glass. "I knew that from the first time we spoke." Barron smiled slightly. "I appreciate that." Monroe's gaze sharpened. "I need to know where you stand." Barron tilted his head. Meaning, Monroe said, his tone dropping. "I need to know if I can count on you." Barron let the silence stretch just long enough. Then he smiled. "You know how the game works, Monroe. Nothing is given for free." Monroe chuckled, nodding. Spoken like someone who understands power. Barron raised his glass. "I understand a lot of things." Their glasses clinked, and as Barron took a sip, he knew Monroe had bought the act. The man believed he had won, but he had no idea that the game had only just begun. In the weeks that followed, Barron began making his own moves. Carefully, strategically. He reached out to the right people, those who had their own reasons for wanting Monroe's influence to crumble. Some were eager to talk, others needed convincing. But piece by piece, the network started to form. The first to join him was a former ally of Monroe's, a man who had been pushed out when he was no longer useful. "He's been bleeding people dry for years," the man told Barron. "I'd be happy to watch him fall." The next was a woman who worked deep within the media, someone who had seen firsthand how Monroe manipulated narratives to his advantage. "If you want to take him down," she said, "you'll need to control the story before he does." Barron nodded. That's the plan. Each new piece of information, each new ally, brought him closer to the moment when he could strike. The trick was patience. Because Monroe wasn't just a man to be defeated, he was a man to be outplayed. And when the time came, Barron intended to make sure the entire world was watching. One night, he received another message from the unknown number. "It's time." Barron took a slow breath, staring at the words on his screen. Then he sent a reply. "I'm ready." The next morning, Monroe woke up to a headline he never expected to see. A story exposing the intricate web of influence he had built, the hidden deals, the quiet threats, the way he had manipulated his way into controlling more than anyone realized. And at the center of it all, the person leading the charge against him, Barron Trump. The game was no longer in the shadows. Now it was being played in front of the entire world. And Barron had just made his opening move. The city was already awake when Barron stepped onto the balcony of his penthouse, the skyline stretching out before him like a battlefield. He had barely slept. Not that it mattered. Sleep was a luxury he couldn't afford now. The world had changed overnight. His name was on every news outlet, his face plastered across every major headline. Barron Trump turns against Monroe, exposes political corruption in shocking midnight report. Power play. How Barron Trump just became the most dangerous man in politics. A Trump goes to war, but not against who you think. He scrolled through the headlines on his phone, his expression unreadable. He knew this was only the beginning. Monroe wouldn't go down quietly. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. "Come in." The door opened and Olivia stepped in, her face tight with concern. "You've seen the news?" Barron gave her a look. "You think I haven't?" She sighed, walking toward him. "We expected a reaction, but this..." She held up her phone, scrolling through the avalanche of reports. Some of Monroe's allies are already making moves. They're trying to discredit you, frame this as some personal vendetta. Barron smirked, shaking his head. "Of course they are. They're saying you're a spoiled kid trying to play politics, that you don't understand what you're getting into." He set his phone down, leaning against the railing. "Let them talk. They're already lining up interviews to spin the narrative." Barron turned, his expression sharp. "Then we control the narrative before they do." Olivia hesitated. That's easier said than done. Monroe has decades of influence behind him, people who owe him favors, networks that will back whatever he says. Barron folded his arms. "Then we make sure that for every lie he tells, we hit him with the truth twice as hard." She watched him carefully. "You sound like you've already planned your next move." He nodded. "Because I have." The first counterattack came fast. By midday, Monroe's people had flooded the media with statements dismissing Barron as inexperienced, reckless. They painted him as a bored, rich kid trying to stir up drama. They questioned his credibility, his knowledge of the political world, even his sanity. "Barron Trump is young. He doesn't understand the complexity of these matters," Monroe said in a carefully staged press conference. "It's easy to make accusations, it's harder to govern." Barron watched the interview from a secure location, his team gathered around. They had expected this. Monroe's strength was controlling perception, and he had spent years mastering it. "He's acting like a king addressing his subjects," Olivia muttered, shaking her head. "Like he's untouchable." Barron leaned back in his chair, eyes narrowing. "That's because he still thinks he is." His phone vibrated, a message from an unknown number. "You drew first blood. Now comes the real fight." Barron exhaled slowly. He already knew that. Now it was time to push harder. The strategy was simple: overwhelm. Within hours, Barron's team released the first set of documents. Evidence of Monroe's backdoor deals, financial records that linked him to offshore accounts, proving he had been laundering money through shell companies. Emails exposing his private conversations with corporate giants, manipulating policies to benefit their interests at the expense of the public. It was enough to make headlines again. By nightfall, news anchors were no longer treating Barron like a child throwing accusations. They were asking serious questions about Monroe's political empire. Monroe's team scrambled. They denied the reports. They called the documents fake. But then, one of Monroe's former allies, one Barron had flipped weeks ago, came forward on live television. "I was part of it. I saw it happen." The media exploded. Monroe's world was beginning to crack. Monroe called him that night. Barron sat in his office, staring at the name on his phone screen. He had been expecting this. He let it ring twice before answering. "Barron." Monroe's voice was steady, controlled, but there was an unmistakable edge to it. "You're working late," Barron said casually. Monroe didn't acknowledge the joke. "You've made a mistake." "Have I?" "You think you understand how this works, but you don't. You're playing a game that's been running long before you were born." Barron smirked. "Funny. I thought you said I wasn't playing a game at all." A brief silence. Then Monroe exhaled. "Listen to me carefully. This is your one chance. Walk away from this now and I won't come after you. No consequences. No retaliation." Barron leaned back, pretending to consider it. Tempting. But see, here's the thing. You built your power by making people believe they didn't have a choice, that they had to play by your rules. But I don't play by anyone's rules. Another pause. Then Monroe's voice turned cold. "You should have taken the deal, kid." The line went dead. Barron smiled to himself. Now it was war. The retaliation came fast. By morning, Barron's past was being dissected across every major network. They dug up old photos, careless teenage moments blown out of proportion. They questioned his education, his business ventures, his qualifications. Anonymous sources came forward with fabricated stories, claiming he was unstable, dangerous. Social media was flooded with attacks. Rich kid with daddy's money thinks he can take down Monroe? Laughable. He's a child, he doesn't belong in politics. He'll be gone in a month. Barron read every comment, every headline. Then he turned off his phone. They're going after your reputation, Olivia said, pacing. If they convince people you're unreliable, it won't matter what evidence you have. They won't convince people, Barron said simply. How can you be sure? He looked at her, his expression calm. Because I have something they don't, she raised an eyebrow. And what's that? He leaned forward. The truth. The final blow came on a Tuesday morning. A leaked audio recording. Monroe's voice, unmistakable. A private conversation where he laughed about manipulating elections, joked about buying off judges, admitted, clear as day, to crimes that would destroy any politician's career. Barron listened to the recording in silence, the weight of the moment settling in. This is it, Olivia whispered. Barron nodded. Monroe had spent years making sure he was untouchable. But even kings could fall. By noon, the recording was viral. By evening, Monroe's biggest allies had begun to turn on him. By midnight, federal agencies were involved. The empire had crumbled. Barron sat alone on his balcony that night, staring at the city below. It was over. Monroe's reign had ended. The war had been won. His phone buzzed. Another unknown number. He answered, a familiar voice on the other end. You did it, the man said. He's finished. Barron exhaled. Yeah. You understand what happens now, don't you? Barron was silent. You won't just be the guy who took down Monroe. You'll be the guy they fear next. Barron's grip on the phone tightened. You stepped into the fire, the man continued. Now you have to decide what to do with the power you've taken. The call ended. Barron sat in the silence. The fight was over, but the game had only just begun. The morning after Monroe's downfall, the world was different. Barron had expected the shift, but the sheer scale of it was staggering. His name wasn't just in the headlines. It was the headline. News anchors debated his next move. Political analysts speculated about his future, and social media erupted with discussions about whether he was a hero or a dangerous wild card. Some called him a visionary. Others called him reckless. One thing was clear. He wasn't invisible anymore. He had forced his way into the conversation, and now the world was watching. Sitting in his office, he scrolled through the flood of messages. Some were from allies, others from enemies. Some were congratulations, others were thinly veiled threats. One message stood out. It was a simple text from an unknown number. You're in the arena now. Play wisely. Barron stared at it for a long time before putting his phone down. The arena. That's exactly what this was. The real battle wasn't over. It had just begun. Olivia entered the room, placing a folder on his desk. You need to see this. Barron opened it, scanning the contents. It was a report, an analysis of the power vacuum Monroe's fall had created. Monroe hadn't just been a corrupt politician. He had been a keystone in a larger structure, one that connected business, media, and politics in ways most people couldn't even imagine. And now, that structure was collapsing. The people who depended on Monroe are scrambling, Olivia said. Some are looking for new alliances. Some are looking for revenge. Barron closed the folder. And some are waiting to see what I do next. She nodded. Exactly. He leaned back in his chair. So what's our move? Olivia hesitated. That depends. What do you want? That was the real question, wasn't it? Did he just want to expose corruption? Or did he want something more? He had torn down a king. Now, he had to decide whether to take the throne or burn it down completely. The calls started pouring in. Influential figures, business leaders, foreign diplomats. Everyone wanted a meeting. Everyone wanted to know where Barron stood. Some offered alliances. Others issued warnings. One call stood out. A senator, one of Monroe's old rivals. "I have a proposition," the man said. "You have influence now, more than you realize. You could use it." "For what?" Barron asked. "To reshape things, to do more than just expose corruption, to create something better." Barron smirked. "And I suppose you have a plan for that?" The senator chuckled. "Not a plan. A suggestion. Join the game. Make real change." A pause. "You brought down Monroe. You've proven you can fight the system. Now the question is, can you lead it?" The call ended, but the words lingered in Barron's mind. "Can you lead it?" Olivia watched him carefully. "You're thinking about it, aren't you?" Barron exhaled. "What if they're right?" "About what?" "That I have more influence than I thought. That I could actually change something." Olivia didn't answer right away. Finally, she said, "If you go down that path, you won't just be fighting corruption anymore. You'll be part of the system." Barron nodded. "I know. Are you ready for that?" He didn't answer, because deep down, he wasn't sure. That night, Barron stood on the rooftop of his penthouse, looking over the city. A city that had once ignored him. Now it belonged to him, at least in a way. He pulled out his phone. One number, one call, a choice. After a long moment, he dialed. The line rang once, twice, then a voice answered. Mr. Trump Barron took a breath. "I'm ready." The game was just beginning. The city never truly slept, but in the dead of night, when most people retreated into their lives, the real players of the game moved in silence. Barron had made his decision. Now he had to act on it. As he stepped into the sleek black car waiting for him, he knew this meeting would define the next chapter of his life. The destination wasn't some high-rise boardroom or a secret underground bunker. It was a small, unmarked building in a quiet neighborhood, the kind of place no one would suspect held any real power. But Barron knew better. Inside that building, decisions were made that shaped the world. And tonight, he was stepping into that world for the first time as a player, not just an observer. The car pulled up to the entrance. No security detail, no grand display of wealth, just a simple black door with no markings. Barron stepped out, adjusted his jacket, and walked inside. A man waited for him. Older, with sharp, calculating eyes. Not a politician, not a businessman, something in between. "You're punctual," the man said, nodding approvingly. "That's a good sign." Barron smirked. "I figured keeping people waiting isn't a luxury I can afford." The man gestured toward a chair. "Sit." Barron did. A thick file was placed in front of him. No words, just an invitation to look. He opened it. Inside were names, connections, deals that had shaped the political landscape for the past 20 years, and now he was being invited to take part in it. "This," the man said, "is the real system, the one behind the headlines, the one behind the votes." Barron turned a page, scanning familiar faces in unfamiliar contexts, allies and enemies, all tangled together. "What do you want from me?" he asked. The man smiled. "The better question is, what do you want?" Barron looked at him, holding his gaze. "I want control." The smile widened. "Then you're in the right place." The meeting lasted hours. They talked about alliances, threats, the power Monroe had wielded, and the vacuum left behind. Barron listened, asked questions, tested the boundaries. By the end of it, he had something more valuable than power. He had understanding. He knew now that influence wasn't just about making decisions. It was about positioning, leverage, knowing when to push and when to pull back. And more importantly, he knew who his real enemies were. The ones who had stayed quiet during Monroe's downfall. The ones who were still watching, waiting. When he left the building, the city looked the same. But it wasn't. Because now he was part of it. Not as a pawn, not as an outsider, as a player. And the game was just getting started. Barron stepped out into the night, the cold air sharp against his skin. The city stretched before him, a web of lights and shadows, each window holding a life, a story, a motive. He had spent his life watching, learning, absorbing. But tonight, he had taken his first step into the game, and now it was time to make his first move. The car door closed behind him with a quiet click. The driver didn't speak. He knew better. This wasn't a night for small talk. Barron leaned back, his mind racing. The file he had just read was burned into his memory. Names, connections, hidden deals that shaped policies before the public even knew they existed. Power was never about who stood at the podium. It was about who controlled the hands that wrote the speeches, who whispered in the ears of kings. And tonight, he had been given a choice: to play along or to change the rules. Barron smirked to himself. There was never really a choice. The first call he made wasn't to a politician. It wasn't to a business partner. It was to someone far more important. It rang twice before a voice answered. "You shouldn't be calling this number." "I don't care," Barron replied. "I have something you need to hear." Silence. Then, a slow exhale. "Go on." Barron didn't hesitate. He laid it out: Monroe's downfall, the shifting alliances, the power vacuum left behind. He spoke about the names in that file, the ones who had stayed quiet, the ones who were still watching. "I know where the pressure points are," Barron said. "And I know who's waiting to move next." The voice on the other end of the line was unreadable. "You're young," they finally said. "Too young to be playing at this level." Barron's grip tightened on the phone. "I'm not playing." Another pause. Then, something unexpected. A chuckle. "All right," the voice said. "Let's see what you can do." The next 48 hours moved fast. Barron had no intention of sitting back and waiting. He had names now, and more importantly, he had leverage. His first target was a senator, one who had built a career on loyalty, but had spent the last few months hedging his bets. Barron didn't call him. He showed up at his office, unannounced, unscheduled. The senator's assistant nearly fell over trying to stop him, but Barron didn't break stride. By the time the senator looked up from his desk, Barron was already standing in front of him. "You should have called," the senator said, leaning back in his chair. "You should have picked a side," Barron countered. The senator's expression darkened. "I don't respond well to threats." Barron smiled. "Good thing I'm not threatening you." He placed a single sheet of paper on the desk. The senator glanced at it, and his face lost all color. Because that sheet of paper held something more dangerous than a threat. It held the truth. The senator had tried to play both sides, supporting Monroe in private, but keeping an escape route open in case things turned bad. Now Barron had proof, and he had a choice: expose him or own him. "You have a week," Barron said, standing up. "Decide where your loyalty lies." He turned to leave but paused at the door. "Oh, and Senator?" The man looked up, his hands clenched into fists. "Next time," Barron said. "I won't give you a choice." It was just the beginning. Barron wasn't interested in building alliances based on empty promises. He wanted control, influence, the kind of power that didn't need to be spoken aloud. He spent the next 2 days making more visits. No press, no security, just quiet conversations behind closed doors. By the end of the week, he had flipped 2 senators, 3 high-level advisors, and a media executive who thought he was untouchable. The landscape was shifting, and Barron was the one pulling the strings. The final meeting of the week wasn't in an office. It was in a quiet restaurant, the kind where no one asked questions. The man waiting for him was older, sharper, someone who had survived decades in the game without losing his edge. "You've been busy," he said as Barron sat down. Barron shrugged. Just cleaning up a mess? The man smirked. You remind me of someone. Barron raised an eyebrow. Should I be flattered? The man leaned forward. That depends. Are you here to ask for something? Or to take it? Barron didn't hesitate. To take it. A slow, knowing nod. Then let's talk. The game had changed, and Barron Trump was just getting started. The restaurant hummed with low conversations, the clinking of glasses, the occasional laugh from a table across the room. But at this table, there was only silence, a weighted kind, the type that filled the space between two people who both understood they were standing on the edge of something irreversible. The man across from Barron was no ordinary power player. He was old money, the kind of wealth that didn't come from one smart deal, but from generations of quiet, calculated moves. A man who had watched presidents rise and fall, who had advised kings while never wearing a crown himself. Tonight, he wasn't smiling. You've made quite the entrance, he said, stirring his drink. People are talking. Good, Barron replied. The man chuckled. That depends. You've got some of them nervous, others intrigued. Barron leaned back. And which one are you? The man's gaze sharpened. Still deciding. Barron smirked. Then let me make it easy for you. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a small flash drive, placing it on the table between them. The man didn't reach for it. He just studied it, like it was a loaded weapon. And what's this? He asked. Insurance, Barron said. Leverage. A way to remind certain people that their pasts are closer than they think. The man exhaled slowly, his fingers tapping against the glass. You don't waste time, do you? Time is the only thing I don't have in excess. That was a lie. Barron had time. He had his whole life ahead of him. But he also understood something most men in this world learned too late. Power belonged to those who took it first, and he wasn't waiting his turn. The man finally picked up the flash drive, weighing it in his palm. I assume this isn't a gift. Barron smiled. It's a test. A pause. Then another slow chuckle. And if I pass? Then we start talking about what comes next. The man studied him for a long moment, then slipped the drive into his pocket. All right, he said. You have my attention. That was the first major line Barron had drawn. And once it was crossed, there was no going back. By the end of the night, that flash drive had been plugged into a secure computer. By morning, a handful of calls had been made, and by afternoon, another power shift was in motion, one that no one had seen coming. Barron spent the next week doing what he did best, watching, calculating, pushing people just far enough that they had no choice but to pick a side. Some chose wisely, others didn't. By the time he was done, 5 more names had been crossed off his list, not through threats, not through force, through something far more dangerous. Exposure. The thing about power was that it wasn't about how much money you had or how many connections you could name. It was about how well you could control the story. And Barron was proving to be very, very good at rewriting narratives. One night, as he stood on the balcony of his penthouse, his phone buzzed. Unknown number. That made him smile. He answered without hesitation. You're making enemies, a voice said. A woman's, smooth, amused. Barron swirled the whiskey in his glass, watching the city below. Only the ones worth having. A soft laugh. You sound like your father. Barron's jaw tensed slightly. Do I? Oh yes, she said. And that makes you very interesting. Barron didn't reply. He let the silence work for him, knowing she'd speak again first. She did. I think it's time we met, she said. Don't you? Barron smirked. Where and when? Leave that to me, she said. I'll be in touch. The line went dead. Barron set the phone down, his mind already piecing together the possibilities. He didn't know who she was yet, but he knew one thing. She wouldn't have called if she wasn't important. And in this game, importance meant power. the kind he was about to claim for himself. The invitation arrived the next morning, delivered by hand, sealed in a thick black envelope with nothing but his name on it. No return address, no insignia, just a time and a place. 9 p.m. The Metropolitan Club. A fitting choice. Old money, old power. A place where billionaires whispered secrets over steak dinners and glasses of bourbon that cost more than most people's mortgages. Barron ran his fingers over the envelope before opening it. The card inside was just as simple. White, heavy stock, embossed letters. Come alone. That part made him grin. At precisely 8:57 p.m., Barron stepped through the club's entrance. The doormen barely glanced at him, already knowing his name, already knowing he belonged. That was the thing about places like this. They didn't ask questions if you walked in like you owned the building. The Maître d' led him through the dimly lit dining room, past men who had built empires and destroyed them with a single phone call. He saw a few familiar faces. Some nodded in acknowledgement. Others watched him with quiet calculation. They knew. They knew something was happening, something shifting, and they knew he was at the center of it. The private dining room at the back of the club was already occupied when he arrived. She sat at the head of the long mahogany table, swirling a glass of deep red wine. Early 40s, poised, with the kind of beauty that didn't fade. It evolved. The kind that came from power rather than youth. She looked up as he entered, her lips curving in amusement. "You're punctual." Barron took the seat across from her. "I don't like to waste time." She raised her glass slightly. "A trait we have in common." He leaned back, studying her. "You called me. That means you need something." She chuckled. "Oh, Barron, you assume too much." "Do I?" She tilted her head, considering him. "I've been watching you." "I assumed as much. And I have to say, I'm impressed. You've done in months what takes most men years, shifting alliances, exposing weaknesses, consolidating influence." Barron shrugged. "It's not complicated. People are predictable." She smiled at that. "And yet, you're unpredictable. That's why I called." He rested his elbows on the table. "Then tell me why I'm here." Her eyes gleamed. "Because I think it's time you and I worked together." Barron didn't react immediately. He let the silence stretch just enough to make her wonder. Then he smirked. "That depends." She lifted an eyebrow. "On? On whether you're offering me a seat at the table, or if you're just trying to put me in your pocket." Her laughter was soft, but there was genuine delight in it. "Oh, I like you. I'm not here to be liked." She sipped her wine. "And that's why you'll win." Barron let a beat pass. "So tell me, what's the play?" She set her glass down and leaned forward slightly. "It's simple. There are people in this city who need to be reminded that power doesn't belong to them by default. They've grown too comfortable, too complacent. And it's time for a shift." Barron exhaled slowly, tapping his fingers against the table. "You want me to be your executioner?" She smiled again. "I want you to be my partner." There it was, the real offer. The room felt smaller suddenly, the air heavier, because this wasn't just another deal. This was an invitation into something bigger than himself, bigger than the chessboard he had been playing on. This was another level entirely. "What's in it for me?" he asked. Her eyes gleamed. "More than you can imagine." That night, Barron left the club with more than just a handshake deal. He left with a roadmap, a strategy, a name, and the first real move in a game that had no rules. By the time the sun rose, the first domino had already fallen, and by the time the world caught up, it was too late to stop what was coming. Barron Trump wasn't just playing anymore. He was taking over. By the time the headlines hit, the deal was already done. Barron sat in his penthouse, watching the news cycle struggle to keep up. Some reporters were still speculating, trying to piece together the fragments of information they had. Others had already made the call, stating it plainly for the world to hear. Power shift. Barron Trump secures unprecedented influence in New York's financial sector. Unexpected alliance forms as Trump heir reshapes the boardrooms of Manhattan. Wall Street stunned by strategic takeover. Youngest Trump proves he's no shadow figure. He smirked as the commentators tried to dissect his moves, as if they hadn't been years in the making. They talked about his age, his last name, his connections, but none of them saw what really mattered. He wasn't playing by their rules, and that made him dangerous. His phone buzzed. A message. It's done. They're out. The board is yours. A slow, satisfied exhale left his lips. They never saw it coming. It started with whispers. A few key players feeling an unexpected shift in the winds. Then came the meetings, private discussions behind closed doors, offers that couldn't be refused, pressure in the right places, and then, like a well-executed symphony, the moment of collapse. The old guard was out. And Barron? He was sitting in their chair. His phone buzzed again, this time a call. He let it ring twice before answering. "Congratulations," the voice on the other end said, smooth, calculated, amused. Barron leaned back in his chair. It was inevitable, a chuckle. Inevitable? Maybe, but not many people could have done it this fast. "I don't waste time." "No, you don't," a pause. "Which is why I'm calling." Barron's eyes flickered toward the skyline. "Go on." "You didn't just take a seat at the table," the voice continued. "You built your own. That means the rules are yours now." He smiled. "That's the idea. Then let's talk about what comes next. Another power play, another move, and this time, the whole world was watching." Barron Trump stood at the edge of the penthouse balcony, the cold night air brushing against his face. Below him, the heartbeat of New York City pulsed. Bright lights, endless motion, power shifting like unseen currents in the streets below. He had just pulled off one of the most unexpected takeovers in modern financial history, and yet the real game was just beginning. His phone vibrated again, the screen flashing a name he had been expecting. He let it ring for a moment, allowing the weight of the moment to settle before answering. "You finally decided to call," he said, his voice smooth but firm. The voice on the other end was deep, authoritative. A man who had spent decades maneuvering through power, now confronted with a player he had underestimated. "You think this is over?" the voice asked. Barron smirked. "Number. But I think your part in it is." A sharp inhale on the other end. The man had built an empire on calculated decisions, on the assumption that he controlled the board. And now, in the span of a few strategic moves, that control had slipped from his fingers. "You have no idea what you've just done," the voice continued, low and dangerous. "You think you can just walk into this world and take over?" Barron turned away from the city, stepping inside where the glow of his screens illuminated the room. A dozen news channels flickered in front of him, headlines dissecting every angle of what had just happened. "I didn't walk in," he said, his tone measured. "I built my own door." A tense silence followed. Barron could almost hear the man grinding his teeth, weighing his next move. "You're making enemies," the voice finally said. Barron chuckled, settling into his chair. "I know. Power doesn't work like this. There are rules. Rules that were made to keep people like me out." Barron leaned forward. "That's the difference between us. You spent your whole career protecting the system. I'm rewriting it." The voice on the other end went quiet, and Barron knew he had struck a nerve. "You're too young to understand what happens next," the man said, almost pitying. "You just lit a match in a room full of gasoline. You can't control the explosion." Barron glanced at the encrypted emails lighting up his laptop screen. Proposals, threats, alliances being formed and broken in real time. "I don't need to control it," he said simply. I just need to be the only one standing when the fire dies out. Another pause. Then a quiet, grudging chuckle. You really are his son, aren't you? Barron's lips twitched into a small smile. You're just figuring that out now. The call ended, but the game was still in motion. He glanced at the time. Midnight. Another long night ahead. The next step? Letting the world know that this wasn't just a power shift. This was a reckoning. Barron leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled together as he listened to the distant hum of the city beneath him. The weight of the moment settled heavily on his shoulders, yet it wasn't burden. It was clarity, the kind of clarity that only comes when the pieces of a puzzle align in a way that no one else saw coming. The move he had just made would send shockwaves through the financial world, disrupting alliances that had been forged in smoke-filled back rooms decades before he was even born. He knew what they were thinking, the titans of industry, the old guards of power, the men who had always operated under the assumption that time would eventually erode all opposition and leave them untouched. They had never considered that a new player, one who had learned from a lifetime of watching the game, would not only challenge them, but rewrite the very rules they had spent their lives mastering. The air in the room was thick with the scent of coffee, the screens before him displaying a symphony of real-time reactions. News anchors scrambling to make sense of what had just unfolded, financial analysts scrambling to explain why everything they had predicted had just been thrown out the window, and somewhere, behind closed doors, the very people who had once dismissed him were now whispering his name with a mixture of disbelief and quiet dread. Barron let his gaze drift to the flashing stock numbers, watching the ripple effect of his decisions play out in real time. The numbers weren't just figures. They were the tangible proof that the world he had envisioned, the world they told him was impossible to shape, was bending to his will. His phone vibrated again, another incoming message, this time from a number he had flagged months ago. He exhaled slowly before answering. I assume this isn't a social call, he said, his voice even, giving nothing away. A sharp inhale on the other end of the line, then a pause, as if the caller was choosing their words carefully. You don't realize the kind of enemies you're making, the voice finally said. Barron almost laughed. I know exactly the kind of enemies I'm making, he responded smoothly, glancing at the encrypted messages flooding his inbox. Requests for meetings, warnings disguised as pleasantries, veiled threats from men who had never known a world where they weren't in control. The question is, do you realize what that means? The voice on the other end hesitated, an almost imperceptible shift in tone that told Barron everything he needed to know. They were nervous. They weren't used to this. The rules they had lived by their entire lives dictated that people like Barron, young, underestimated, an outsider to their inner circle, were supposed to take their place in line, not rewrite the hierarchy. You think power is something you can just take, the voice continued, a thinly veiled attempt at condescension. But real power, the kind that lasts, isn't built overnight. Barron stood, walking to the window, letting the city lights paint shadows across his face. And yet, here we are, he said, his voice quiet but sharp. You're calling me. Another silence. Barron could almost picture the scene on the other end. A man in a dimly lit office, staring at his phone, realizing in real time that the world he once controlled was slipping through his fingers. You've started something you can't stop, the man finally said, his voice carrying the weight of a warning. Barron smirked, shaking his head. I never planned to stop, he said, before ending the call and tossing the phone onto the desk. He knew this was just the beginning. The real challenge wasn't in taking power, it was in holding it. But he was prepared for that. He had been preparing for this his whole life, even when he didn't realize it. He turned back to his screens, the glow reflecting in his eyes as he watched the world react to his every move. The night was far from over, and neither was he. Barron sat back in his chair, eyes locked on the series of screens before him, the city skyline flickering in the reflection of his desk. He could almost feel the pulse of the world, his world, shifting beneath his fingertips. The calls, the messages, the whispers. They were all a part of the symphony he was conducting now. The pieces of the puzzle were finally falling into place, but Barron knew this was only the beginning. His phone buzzed again, this time with a text from Olivia. "Monroe's team is preparing for retaliation. They're not going to let you get away with this." Barron's lips curled into a tight smile. I never expected them to. The war, as he knew it, was no longer about controlling the present. It was about shaping the future. Monroe might have thought he was untouchable, but Barron had proved him wrong. And now, the power he had taken wasn't just his. It was the key to rewriting the very rules of the game. The phone buzzed again. Another number. Another player. He looked at the screen, taking a slow breath. The city's in motion. People are watching. What comes next? The message was simple, but Barron knew exactly what it meant. "What comes next," he typed back, "is a new order." He stood, walking over to the window, looking out at the city once again. This city, his city, had always been a battleground for the powerful, but now the game had changed. He was no longer just an observer. He was the one pulling the strings. 2. Something he hadn't expected. A thrill. An undeniable sense of purpose. He had never felt more alive, more in control. The future was his to shape, and he wasn't going to let anyone, especially not the ones who underestimated him, take that away. The power was real, and it was his. And as Barron Trump leaned back, the lights of the city stretching out before him, he knew one thing for certain. This was just the beginning. Barron turned away from the window, the weight of the city's lights reflecting off the cold glass. But in his mind, it wasn't the lights that held his focus. It was the future, unfolding at his feet like a chessboard. The pieces were moving quickly now, and Barron knew how to play the game, how to manipulate, how to control. His moves were calculated, every word spoken, every meeting arranged, designed with one goal: to make sure that no one ever questioned his place at the top again. His phone buzzed again, a string of messages from key figures, allies, foes, and some with more ambiguous motivations. All of them were either scrambling to adapt or preparing their counterattacks. But Barron felt no panic. Instead, a calm determination settled over him. He was untouchable now. They didn't understand the level of his game. They were still playing checkers while he was playing chess. A knock at the door snapped him from his thoughts. Olivia entered with a folder in her hands, her expression unreadable. She set the folder on the table between them, her eyes meeting his. "They're mobilizing," she said, her voice low, careful. "Some are already making moves against you. Others are waiting for the right time." Barron picked up the folder, flipping it open, his fingers brushing over the documents. His eyes scanned the pages. Intel on his enemies, financial statements, security breaches, and even whispers from people who thought they could use him. Every detail was accounted for, every potential weakness exposed. He set the folder down and looked up at Olivia. "Let them move. Let them underestimate me." Her lips pressed into a thin line. "You're not worried?" Barron stood up, straightening his jacket, a quiet smile playing at his lips. "Worried?" He shook his head, a faint laugh escaping him. "Number, I've been waiting for this. The real power isn't in what they think they can do to me. It's in how I respond." Olivia gave him a long look, but Barron was already thinking ahead. The next step had to be swift, precise. He needed to maintain momentum, keep everyone guessing. The game was evolving, and Barron wasn't about to let anyone take the lead from him now. The phone buzzed again. He glanced at it, a smirk forming. He answered, his voice smooth and confident. "Yes." A voice on the other end, cold and calculating, greeted him. "You don't know what you've started." Barron leaned back, his fingers tapping on the desk. Oh, I know exactly what I've started. And trust me, it's just getting started. The line went silent, and Barron could almost hear the realization sinking in. They were no longer in control of the game. He was. As the night unfolded, Barron made his moves in silence, each step more deliberate than the last. The first domino had fallen, but there were more to come. He wasn't just playing for the present, he was securing his place in the future. And for the first time in his life, Barron Trump knew that no matter how dark the night got, he was always going to be one step ahead. The world hadn't seen anything yet. The future was his. And it was just beginning. Barron sat back, staring at the screen of his phone. The night was deepening, but his mind was sharp. Clear. It had to be. The moves he was making now, the alliances he was weaving, the strategies he was crafting, they had to be perfect. Every second mattered. There was no room for mistakes. His eyes flicked over the messages from various power players, some eager for his favor, others trying to gauge his next move, and a few, he suspected, already plotting against him. They all wanted something, but Barron knew the game. He wasn't just a pawn in their world. He was the one dictating the rules now. He tossed the phone aside, his fingers flexing as if already preparing for the next step. The power was shifting, and Barron was at the center of it. What the world didn't realize yet was that he wasn't just going to follow in the footsteps of those who came before him. He wasn't going to be a shadow of his father, nor the figurehead everyone expected him to be. He was going to carve his own legacy. There was a knock at the door. Olivia stepped inside, her expression unreadable, but Barron could see the tension in her posture. She was worried about something. "What's wrong?" he asked, his voice low, his eyes never leaving hers. "They're planning something," she said, her voice steady but with an edge of concern. "Monroe's people are organizing, reaching out to those still loyal to him. They're not going to back down so easily. You've made powerful enemies." Barron gave her a pointed look, his gaze unwavering. "I didn't come here to play it safe." Olivia hesitated, then nodded. "I know, but we need to be prepared. One wrong move and everything could fall apart." Barron's lips curled into a slight smirk, a glint of confidence in his eyes. "It won't. We control the narrative now. Let them make their moves. We'll be ready." As she turned to leave, Barron grabbed his coat, a deep sense of purpose settling over him. The game was far from over. But this time, the table had turned. This time, it was his turn to make the moves. And when the time came, Barron would strike. He had the pieces in place, the resources at his disposal. Now it was all about timing. The world would soon learn that Barron Trump wasn't just a name, he was a force to be reckoned with. The phone buzzed again, interrupting Barron's train of thought. He grabbed it without hesitation, expecting the usual updates, the typical messages. But this one was different. "Are you ready?" the message read. A smile tugged at the corner of Barron's lips. It was time. He stood, pacing toward the door. This was the moment. He had spent so much time analyzing, plotting, maneuvering, and now it was all coming to a head. The opponents, the allies, the enemies, they were all set to make their moves. But Barron had already anticipated every single one of them. The city stretched out before him as he made his way into the night. It felt different now, almost alive with possibility. The streets were still crowded, the night air thick with anticipation, but Barron felt a sense of calm settle over him. The world had always underestimated him, but that was about to change. Every decision he made now would have far-reaching consequences. But Barron was confident. He had already seen the path. He knew how to play the game, and more importantly, how to win. The next step was crucial. It would define everything that followed. And Barron Trump wasn't about to let anyone, least of all his enemies, control the outcome. It was his turn, and he was going to make it count. A few days later, Barron stood on the rooftop of his penthouse, overlooking the city. It was quieter now, the chaos of the last few days settling into something more manageable. But Barron knew better than to be complacent. His enemies were still out there, still plotting, still trying to outplay him. But the game had changed. Barron had learned the power of timing, of leverage. He had learned how to manipulate the story, how to control the narrative. His phone buzzed again. A new message, a familiar name. "It's time," the message said. Barron smiled to himself. The final move was coming, and he was ready. The city had no idea what was coming next, but Barron did. And this time, he wasn't just in the game, he was running it. As he dialed the number, Barron's mind raced with the possibilities. Monroe had underestimated him. The media had underestimated him. Even the people closest to him, his allies, his own team, had no idea how deep the strategy went. But Barron was the one who held all the cards now. He clicked the phone off, stood up, and turned back to the window. The future was his, and he was going to make sure that no one would ever forget it. Barron stood by the window, the city lights sprawling out before him like a sea of gold. The night felt different, heavy with possibility. He had spent the last several days orchestrating a series of moves, laying traps, and weaving alliances. But this moment was the turning point. His phone buzzed again. This time, it was a call. He glanced at the screen. Unknown number. A faint smile touched his lips. The real players always called when the game was on the edge of changing. He answered. "Barron," the voice on the other end said, sharp, authoritative. "You've made your move, but you're not as untouchable as you think." Barron leaned against the windowsill, his voice smooth, unfazed. "I don't need to be untouchable. I just need to be one step ahead." The voice chuckled, a cold sound that made Barron's eyes narrow. "You think you can control this? The power you've just stirred up? You're playing with fire, and fire always burns." Barron's gaze shifted from the skyline to the shadows around the room. His mind was a razor-sharp machine, constantly calculating. "I'm not playing with fire," he said, his voice calm, but every word dripping with purpose. "I'm the one holding the match." The line went silent for a moment, and Barron could hear the shift in the voice on the other end. "You're underestimating the forces at play here, Barron. The people behind Monroe, behind all of this, are not just going to roll over. They will push back." Barron's lips curled into a smile. "Let them. The real question is, how long can they hold on before they realize that the game has already changed?" There was a long pause. The voice sounded less certain now. "We'll see how long your confidence lasts." Barron exhaled slowly, almost amused. "I'm not worried about my confidence. I'm worried about what you'll do when you realize you've already lost." He hung up before the other side could respond. The world was waking up to the reality of his rise. It was no longer about speculation, rumors, or the name he carried. It was about Barron Trump making his mark in a way no one had predicted. And now, with each move, each word, he was reshaping the very nature of power. No one had seen him coming, and now that he was here, there was no turning back. He walked to his desk, his fingers brushing over the files laid out in front of him. Names, connections, deals that had been hidden in the dark. He was no longer just a player in the background. He was the one calling the shots, dictating the terms. The next few moves would solidify his place at the table, but Barron was already thinking beyond that. The real power wasn't in what he had, but in what he was about to take. A new message flashed on his phone, another key player trying to gauge his next move. Barron smirked. He wasn't just a player in their game anymore. He was the one they had to reckon with. "Time's up," he whispered to himself. He stood tall, his face now a mask of calm resolve. "Now it's my turn." Barron grabbed his jacket, slipping it on with practiced ease. He knew what was coming. The world was about to change, and he was the one who was going to change it. As he stepped out into the night, the weight of his decisions, the strength of his resolve, all settled over him. The chessboard had been set, and this time, Baron Trump wasn't just playing, he was winning. The city waited, and Barron was ready.